You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy. A bow and a curtsy to all the monarchies of the world, and a bow and a curtsy to all their loyal subjects as well. Everybody, welcome to another edition of Brobears Talk, where we'll be addressing the current state of the British monarchy and the implications for monarchies of the future. Brother Bear, welcome.
Thank you, Brother Bear. This sounds like a very topical topic, if I may say so, with the whole affair around Meghan and Harry being hot on the news agenda.
Absolutely. I thought we should strike when the iron, the regal iron, that is, very hot. The situation we're seeing right now in the UK, some are calling it a bit of a watershed moment in terms of the international and domestic perceptions of the royals. Stock markets have been quite adversely affected, at least in the very short term, by Meghan's criticisms of her treatment by the royal family, and the general implications for people's faith in a system whereby you pay through taxpayer receipts. This high and mighty family in a palace, they're starting to dwindle, particularly in Commonwealth countries. So let's unpack that, Brother Bear, and talk about what the hell's going to happen.
Fascinating, Brother Bear. And you mentioned the stock market, something as complex and sophisticated as the stock market, and modern, should I say, because as we know, the vast majority of trades these days are algo-based. Do you think something as mechanism that's that sophisticated and complex has actually been affected, and you're seeing ripples of that off the back of this disgruntlement, or are there other dynamics at play here?
I think there is. I wouldn't say a direct, highly direct link, but there has been a talk in the New York Stock Exchange of the Meghan effect, or the Markle sparkle, as they call it. And these are talking more about kind of the fashion industries, from apparel to jewelry and bags and shoes, and obviously the market share of those is huge when it comes to the stock exchange as a whole.
Yeah.
So there's certainly some fluctuations we've seen in luxury brands because of the words of Meghan. So that obviously has a ripple effect. The pair of them, Meghan and Harry, have already had quite the effect on ethical and sustainable stocks and shares. Particularly their fondness for cruelty-free underwear has caused a rise in those kind of vegan wares and products.
Yes, indeed. Well, that sort of commentary, I suppose, doesn't go unnoticed. And you sound like a macroeconomist, Brother Bear, when you speak about even these, maybe in the perceptions of a layman such as myself, rather minor ripples on the pond, but in fact, have far-reaching effects of the banks of the other side. Yeah,
certainly. And I think that whenever there's a wider skepticism or volatility in people's perceptions of an institution, and in this case it's the highest arbiter of law in the land, the Crown in the UK, I think that's going to have a knock-on effect on currency and markets. So these kind of these kind of words don't go unnoticed, but I think my knowledge of the stock market effects is fairly minimal. But what I wanted to talk about with you, Brother Bear, is really the broader social effects of life in the UK and around the world. I'm calling in from Canada, which we have the Queen on our money over here.
Rightly so.
Rightly so. So I think the discussion should be: is that still warranted? Does the royal family have a place on people's currency these days?
Yes, I think it's still a lot more relevant than people would like to give them credit for. And I think the reason is more than just, tradition based. I think the Queen still yields real power, and if she wanted to, right, could, in theory and technically, interfere with a lot of what Parliament passes and effectively block certain was right if she really wanted to, at least on paper. Now, that's not something she'd do because it wouldn't be in the interest of the Constitution and would compromise the understanding of where the monarchy sits within today's modern political landscape in the United Kingdom. However, I think there is what can't be understated is the symbolic value and importance of the monarchy, because it's an institution, a constitution that's been there for this long. I think it holds real gravitas when it comes to UK politics. And we'll get into the monetary aspects later, and I do apologise for tangenting so hard on the stock market, but you put the bait out there and I had to bite.
No, well, that is your bailiwick, your wheelhouse, Brother Bear, is the more kind of microeconomist of us two. I think go ahead and expound on those areas. But you're certainly right. The monarchy is perhaps understated, particularly by the younger generations in her sphere of influence on lawmaking. And I think her consistency as a head of state also has as Stephen Fry would argue, a positive impact. He calls it an unreasonable concept, or he calls them a preposterous monarchy. But he also argues that the US might benefit from a similar idea to keep the politicians in place.
Yes.
I think this came off the back of the election in 2016, which elected Donald. And this kind of led to him arguing that actually a monarchical head of state reduces extremism on the left and the right. That's one take on it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think on the whole and on balance, the monarchy is a force and a dynamic for stability on balance. It's a very interesting system that we've still got in place here in the UK, and the fact that we have a functioning monarchy that in theory could interfere on a number of levels and at the very highest levels of government in theory. And I say in theory because that power is never exercised these days, and it's understood that would be the case and will remain the case. But it's a very interesting dynamic, and I think one of the things that the Queen has is she spans far greater time spans than the term of any given Prime Minister, which I think is only healthy and only lends a stable hand to British government, of which the Queen, I believe, is an integral part of, or the King, or whoever it is in that position. So I think someone sort of who has that 100,000-foot view of the United Kingdom and everything it's been through over her substantial reign of, what is it now, 70 years? It's getting there, isn't it? I think that's invaluable in the very real sense of that word. As in, it's not a tangible or a monetary or whatever value. You can't label that value, that it's almost intangible in terms of the, I suppose, clarity of thought and understanding of the British context, historical context, is, I mean, it's unparalleled. No other person on the planet has that appreciation, I think, of a country's past, present, and future.
Yeah, the closest America ever had to a monarchy was probably the Kennedys. And I think that a lot of them hold the Kennedys near and dear, and you'll see anyone who's spent some time in America will see airports and interstates and grand government buildings and streets, anything you can think of named after the Kennedys. And I think that there's a warm, fuzzy feeling, an almost communitarian feeling that comes with that, and that's something very intangible that you can't really put a price on. And although I have some grave criticisms of the royal family, I would argue that is one element of value that they deliver. It's quite difficult to understand that out of the British context. And I think that it's interesting how there's a kind of working class support for the royal family in the UK. I don't know if you've ever picked up on that, but even the kind of Labour voters of the north that were traditionally more socialist have a belief in the efficacy of the royal family, in certain members of them do, and I think that's something that's incredibly rare.
Leo, if you're not a royalist now, I shall make you one by the end of this podcast. But yes,
I'd love to be critiqued on my certain anti-royalist stances I have.
Yes, well, we have frustratingly rational views of the world, and I think we're relatively balanced people, and we're pretty aligned on the libertarian standpoint, and we sort of take the best of the left and right from a political perspective. But this is an interesting discourse we could sort of venture into, I suppose, here. So yes, let me give you my 2 cents. Yeah. Or 2 pence. That was never a coin, was it? No, 6pence. Anyway, whatever.
Let me give you my 6pence.
Let me give you my 6pence here, boy.
Go right ahead.
Yeah. So you did mention an interesting point earlier I just want to pick up on and isolate, which was the point that, yes, the interaction between government and the Queen, potentially most famously, apart from the storming of Parliament with the sceptre, which I don't fully understand because I'm such a political imbecile as to the significance of that and what it means and everything. But I'm sure I'm sure it's in there somewhere. I've just never really bothered to dust off that book in my mind and look at it. But nonetheless, I think everyone understands that there is a regular meeting between the Prime Minister, whoever that he or she may be, and the Queen on a weekly basis, which is very interesting and is presented on a very regular basis in sort of, I suppose, common culture via the show that is The Crown, which has been highly popular both in the UK and the US, as per my understanding. And I think that has a non-trivial impact on people's perception of what the monarchy is, particularly this monarchy, because it focuses on the life of Queen Elizabeth II Royale. And it's a very... Sorry, I had to. But it's very interesting as to how they present those dynamics and those relationships all the way going back to Churchill. And I was going to list all the other prime ministers, but all the rest of them that came after Churchill. All the others. And how those dynamics play out, and how the actress is very good at presenting the Queen in some cases as being quite subservient to the Prime Minister, in other instances actually standing her ground on certain issues, and in some people's eyes probably crossing the line. And it always fascinates me, from a very sort of, I suppose, purely speculative perspective as to what extent these sorts of scenarios and dynamics played out in that room within Buckingham Palace.
How beautifully put, Brother Bear. So, to your point there, to the tone of where you were going, cultural
not sure where I was going, but it was more of a statement than any point. I don't know.
No, I think it's interesting to hear your views on this area, because generally throughout my life I've been quite critical of the concept of the monarchy, even in the British scope. But one thing to your point, which I can't ignore, is that monarchies have been known to reduce the levels of political divide in a country. And I think that what we've seen generally in countries with monarchies, whether it's Norway, Britain, Netherlands, Monaco, I can reel off a few more, is that monarchies can have a tendency of reducing the political arguing that takes place in the homeland. So what I feel there, the value there is, less assemblages of corruption, less assemblages of forceful takeover and coup d'etats. This is incredibly timely, given the storming of the Capitol in the US recently. That's never to say that those things, Britain's immune from those things. I've definitely seen a sort of drive towards centrism, and I think that you can firmly say that most monarchies rule from a very centrist approach when they're at the helm of government. So those are the two main benefits I would outline in terms of pushing the monarchist agenda forward.
Yeah, and I suppose a monarchy, I suppose a self-conscious monarchy, or a monarchy that's sufficiently self-conscious, understands that it has to remain somewhat vanilla to survive.
Definitely. It's a survival mechanism. The centrist approach is the easiest way to bring together, and also to encourage efficacy in yourself as an institution from people. That being said, though, the caveat of all that, Brother Bear, is extreme centrism, and I think that certain countries in certain times have followed a rhetoric of extreme centrism, and I feel like
What does that look like? Or like, how does that manifest?
I think there's certain negatives that come with middle of the road liberal democracy, that take compromise to the nth degree, to the point in which nobody benefits, and actually a truly vanilla outcome is not beneficial for any class, any race, any immigrant community, any rich or poor person. Compromise can be taken to an extreme level, which doesn't do any favors for anyone in society.
Yes. Okay, so it's almost on the fence to the extent that no particular demographic sees a tangible benefit.
I would argue you can get to a level of kind of extreme political agnosticism, and I think that can lead to apathy in society. Social malaise actually can lead to a feeling of zero direction.
Yes.
And I would argue that has for many years been the case in the UK. I think that people have gotten so used to the centrist compromise, whether it's a Nick Clegg or a David Cameron. Eventually that cycle was terminated by the Brexit effect. And that's, again, the extreme centrism can lead to general extremism and groups in society pulling in polar opposite directions, which is also not helpful.
Yes. So let me make a couple of cases for the monarchy.
The monarch.
Indeed, the monarch herself, Queen Elizabeth Regina II. So I think there is a non-trivial benefit to having someone who, like I said previously, to my previous point, having someone like the Queen Elizabeth II being around as long as she has and overseeing the country in the capacity of monarch for as long as she has. I think that brings a non-trivial perspective and almost insight to what the country is, the country's identity, and a feeling of stability. She is a bedrock on which I suppose our democracy is somewhat built around. And she plays a non-trivial role as a statesman and representative of the United Kingdom, and I think she does an extremely good job of doing that, in my humble opinion. And I think one of her greatest achievements, and she attests to this and says it's one of her greatest achievements as monarch, is the, I suppose, establishment and development of the Commonwealth legacy. Now, I don't think that necessarily needs to be interpreted as a colonial legacy, but as rather as something potentially much more constructive and collaborative and positive, ultimately. So I think, I shall park that point there for now.
No, I think that's a good point. I think that the collaborative and the cohesive ideas that come out of a monarchy as a head of state, they're not trivial in any way. The critique I would say to that point is that there's never a guarantee of competency coming from the leadership. That being said, in the UK, I would say that we've been fairly lucky, at least with the head of state, with the Queen, in terms of competency and presentation. There's certain aspects of the monarchy that left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth, and I think the thing that would relate around, Andre, is kind of the creation of a class-based society. Now, I'm not pushing an advocate. I'm not advocating necessarily socialism here, where you know the public owns everything. What I'm saying is I feel that part and parcel of classist ideas and that kind of class identity politics, which is quite dangerous, is very wrapped up in monarchies, and that's a cultural phenomenon that we see in societies like the Netherlands, like the UK, like certain nations in the Middle East that have monarchies. And I think that the class-based society is, in terms of its pigeonholing of people, and its sort of taking away of human agency on the cultural level, is quite dangerous.
So I think that point would hold water if we were talking sort of monarchy pre-Victoria, because it wielded much more power back then, and it did enforce, I suppose, a sort of a feudal class system. I'm not sure that exists to the same extent anymore. I think whether you'd struggle to find a correlation with countries with monarchies or without monarchies, in fact, as to whether there is a distinctive class system, and an unhelpful one at that. Because I think there's always people at the top and the bottom of any given hierarchy. Someone has to be bottom, someone has to be top. But yes, I think in terms of distinct classes, the UK's, I don't know whether they exist or whether we've obsessed about it, because you can look at almost any country and establish those class groupings. It just depends on where you put the borders as to where one starts and one ends. And I don't know whether we've just maybe almost, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, as in we talk about class. I mean, it exists, right? You've got the working class, but like, where does working class end and middle class start? And it's like, I don't know if it's an unhelpful and pretty, I suppose, crude ruler against the messy reality that is reality.
You're raising an interesting point there, because you look at countries like the United States where there is no monarchy, and you know you could never confidently say that they don't have class divisions.
Don't we just call them blue collar over there?
Generally, people would refer to themselves as blue collar
or redneck.
And this is the whole thing in America. People, by and large, are not aware of the class-based system. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but they don't obsess about it. There's a drive constantly to self-development.
So is it something that we've just taken a point and upon ourselves to label, and it's actually a dynamic and a reality that's global?
I think it's a dynamic that's global, but I think that in certain countries like the UK, we've obsessed about it to such an extent that
we really have, man. Why is that? It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I really think there's so many complex reasons behind that. My point before was that even though a monarchy isn't necessarily more unequal than a non-monarchy, I mean, you could always make the argument that the Netherlands is a far more equal and you know it's a far more egalitarian country with better social systems than the United States, but yet the Netherlands has a monarchy. So in practice, a monarchy isn't necessarily tantamount to inequality, but the British mentality is obsessed and continues to about class politics and judgment based on if you're rich and poor, and it goes both ways. Why do you think it is? Why?
I don't know. I think partly, yes, it's self-fulfilling prophecy. We almost like to categorize things in helpful things, but I don't know, we've always had a working class, middle class, and upper class. But I don't doubt that it has some grounding in reality. I don't dismiss it by that same token. But I believe the most unequal society, if you're looking at it not so maybe so much from a class perspective, but from an income perspective, I believe is Norway, which is weird. Unequal.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. And that being the difference in income from the richest brackets to the poorest.
Yeah, I believe so. Let me just Google that. Jamie, help us.
Jamie, come on, Jamie. Come on in.
Come on, Jamie. You're being slow.
Come on, wake up. That's quite surprising.
God damn it! It says UK ranks among the most unequal nations in Europe, but is more equal than the US. Wow, which is the most divided, wealthy nation in the world.
But again, the terms that we're talking about here can sometimes be muddled because there's certain countries like the US that are incredibly unequal, but there's huge amounts of mobility within the middle class in a way that it doesn't exist in Europe.
Right, and it's an interesting thing, Brother Bear, because some of the countries that have, the latest countries that have come out of the Soviet bloc, the likes of Belarus and the Ukraine, are coming up as top countries on economic equality.
And
I wonder whether, I believe this is income. So, and that doesn't completely surprise me because coming out of the Soviet bloc, you almost hit the reset button and introduce capitalism. So maybe that makes sense because those the skew you would see on a Bell distribution hasn't come into full fruition yet because it's a relatively young capitalist society.
Right, so they haven't got to that plateau. And also
But this is, yeah, absolutely.
Well, the Eastern Bloc inherited, or didn't inherit, but was outsourced a lot of Western Europe's mining operations, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
that would tell me that potentially their economies are diverse enough to lean back on primary sources of income.
Yeah, well, it feels like society as a whole has been pruned back to a baseline, and then that baseline hasn't been skewed much yet because they've only had 20 odd years or 30 odd years to do it, to skew it from with the introduction of proper true capitalism and bend it to their advantage or personal advantage. But I do believe there is a theory that goes along the lines of, you know, if you were to redistribute all the world's riches, the richest people, give them 30 years and they'll re-emerge as the richest people. Because there is a competence hierarchy.
There's a competence hierarchy, and it's also about the networks, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That's a non-trivial variable.
Because if the networks of trade and trust between business partners are to be taken into account, I feel like eventually that money would slowly go back to sort of a similar shape that it was.
It would exactly do that. It would exactly do that through a combination of variables, which we probably don't have the time to fully discuss in this podcast because we're talking about the monarchy, which is actually in itself an extremely fascinating topic. And Brother Bear, can I just throw one at you?
Throw one hard. Go for it.
Yeah, it's going to pitch this ball.
Pitch it.
Pitch it. So, you Red Sox or Yankees? Go.
It'd be. I'm a Blue Jays fan. I'm afraid it's gonna be Toronto, Canada's MLB team.
Pow.
Sorry, that wasn't the answer you wanted, Brother Bear.
It's okay, Brother Bear. I gave a dwindling pow for that. It's okay.
A mild pow.
A mild pow, which is disapproval. Anyway, Brother Bear, so I was thinking, what do you think to this argument? You know how we talk about, oh, look at these, you know, rich royals living in their palaces, Kensington Palace, Buckingham Palace, Sandringham, Balmoral. You know, this is taxpayers' money. How dare they? This is, you know, often the source of great outrage. And I love this tabloid culture. I think it's toxic, and I think we should get into that in a bit off the back of the whole Meghan thing as well. I think it's hilarious, and I hate them because they are awful.
Yes.
The tabloids, that is.
Yes.
What I'm trying to get at, ultimately, is people talk about all of this net outflow and paying for the royal family to live the life they do. My point is the UK brings a unique attraction, and I think it's an attraction among many, but I think it's a non-trivial one in the sense, I know I'm saying the word non-trivial, but I like it a lot, and I've been using it recently. So
it's a great word.
I think it's a very great word, and it has real meaning. Non-trivial meaning it is not of a trivial variable within the equation. So I think it's an important variable in the equation when you consider UK tourism. I think the royal family is a huge attraction in that equation. What say you?
I think it's incredibly hard to track directly the impact, the positive economic impact of tourism the royal family brings, because you can say, well, look at countries like France. France and the city of Paris attracts the highest amount of tourism than any other European country. Do they have a royal family? No. Does London and the UK have enough attractions organically without that institution? I would argue yes, but nevertheless, I'm sure that the royals bring in millions, if not billions, into the country through tourism. So I'm not going to knock that. Let's actually talk about some figures here, Brother Bear, because you brought the conversation onto a more financial slant, which I like. So the British royal family actually takes more in taxpayer receipts than any other royal family in the world. They're followed quite closely by Monaco, and that's Prince Albert II, and then in third place you've got the Netherlands, and then that's lagged behind a bit by Norway. But the British government, from its people, takes 42.8 million in tax receipts. Now, as we're using the word trivial a lot, Brother Bear, looking into the financials per capita, that isn't actually a huge amount. This is called the sovereign grant, that 42.8 million. The public paid 65 pence per person in 2016 to 17. So that's about the price of a first class stamp. So that isn't actually a high price. I'll give them that. But I don't know, Brother Bear. I have to be quite honest with you. Something deep inside my core still says that that's too much. 65 pence too much.
Well,
I also should add before you shit on my explanation there.
And I will shit on them. You should make no mistake.
Rip it to shreds. The Queen also received 14.9 million that same financial year through sources generated from property rental, another kind of pseudo business resources. So my argument, and I'll give the baton to you in a second, is that the Crown Estate should be privatized, and I'm not necessarily arguing that we should completely abolish the monarchy, tear the buildings down and remove them from the public eye and strip them of their titles and so on and so forth. My argument would only be to completely divorce them from taxpayer receipts, privatize them, allow them to maintain their titles. I believe Spain moved towards a more privatized model with the monarchy, and it certainly cut down on the tabloid attention, which admittedly is toxic. But that would be the ideal outcome from where I'm standing, Brother Bear.
Okay.
Now rip apart, shred it.
So a report in 2019 basically revealed that Queen Elizabeth II and her family cost the British people £67 million during the previous year. So that was in 2019. So factor in 2% inflation from 2017, which is the next figure I'm going to give you. Just according to Visit Britain, tourism in the UK linked to royal residences such as Royal Palace and Windsor Castle adds up to 2.7 million visitors a year. Obviously, caveating a black swan event such as COVID. Let's think about normal times. Another statistic from the consultancy of Brand Finance said that 2017, the monarchy contributed 1.8 billion, that's with a billion with a B, to the UK economy. So assume that 1.8 billion is 90% off. So make 10% of 1.8 billion, that's 180 million, still 3 times as much as they cost the British public in the year 2019, 2% inflation on accrual since 2017. It's about triple, assuming that figure's off by 90%, which it probably isn't. So I think parking that for a second, I think the monarchy is also a non-trivial advocate for the Britain as a stable and civil nation, and I think that probably in part also helps with actual stability that we've experienced in the UK, particularly London, which is why London's become such a haven for financial institutions, and it's no coincidence that we have the largest financial district within Europe. It's because of that century-old stability that financial institutions have found a safe haven in London, and why that isn't the case in places such as Berlin, Paris, other great cities of Europe. It's why we hold that gauntlet within Europe. And don't forget that the City of London brings in more than 10% of the country's GDP, a square mile, that is.
Incredible, isn't it? That one portion of the capital.
A square mile.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a tangible link, though, between the monarchy and the financial returns made in the city?
I do, and it just harkens back to the point we were talking about earlier, which is the fact that we've experienced sort of unprecedented stability in the context of Europe and managed to hold out against a Nazi invasion, in no small part due to Winston Churchill and our, armed forces, and I suppose to a lesser extent the monarchy as well. But I think fundamentally it's a shared identity. It's a shared advocacy of the country and representation at the highest levels of government and international representation, which has been nothing short of exemplary, at least under Queen Elizabeth II. And I do go back to your point around monarchies inherited and therefore somewhat unpredictable, and so I fully agree with that point. I think it's almost like the Roman emperors. You could have a worst case scenario where you end up with a monarch somewhat like Caligula or Nero, right? And that's an absolutely a possibility, and it's a horrific one to think about. But you'd like to think that almost inherited values and ways of bringing up and understood best practice somewhat weeded out the Henry VIII and hopefully brought more Elizabeths to the fore.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly those benefits that come with the presence of a monarchy, and you could accuse a monarchy of being unadaptable, but then the US Constitution isn't exactly the most adaptive document.
Yes.
Yes. Just not having a monarchy doesn't protect you from.
No, absolutely. And sorry, Leo, because I didn't really directly address your point. I went on about World War II, but it was supposed as a point of instability in the 20th century. And what I'm trying to say is there were other points, maybe not as major, but they were such unstable points in the history of the 20th century where I think the monarchy played a non-trivial role in maintaining stability, in the sense that they buttress democracy because they overarch the 4-year term of any given prime minister. And I think that is poorly understood in terms of how much stability that lends the country, because it buttresses a natural and understood identity of the nation and who we are, to probably a greater extent than we appreciate.
Probably to a greater extent that's obvious in front of us, in front of our eyes.
I think the overarching aspect is a real thing, right? There's like prime ministers, presidents come and go, but there is sort of, and she, as in the Queen Elizabeth II, does represent something greater and potentially almost the shared values of a nation. Or at least I'd like to think in my rose-tinted glasses, but then I'm a royalist bastard, so what do I know?
I love that viewpoint, and I think that there's a beautiful feeling that comes with that shared identity and set of values. My concern there is how much they change, and I think in terms of how a country's values change so rapidly. I mean, let's take the case of Germany in the 20th century. It went from a royalist Reich to a liberal democracy to a fascist dictatorship in the space of about 30 or 40 years, which isn't desirable. But if that is the case in a lot of countries, I would be concerned that a monarchy would be at odds with sort of the relative changes that happens in populations. In particular, some monarchies have fallen to extremism. That of Franco Spain, I think there was a lot of collaboration between the monarchy and the fascists, which obviously allowed the fascists to consolidate their power. It's a tough one, right? Because admittedly, there's a massive cultural value in the values that come with the monarchy, but only if you agree with those values.
And so I definitely agree that an absolute monarchy is not the way to go. I think the system we have now, where we have almost a hybrid monarchy,
constitutional.
A hybrid, exactly. What would you call it? Constitutional democracy, or what is it?
Yeah, I
suppose. What the hell are we in?
Constitutional parliamentary democracy. Britain is definitely a democracy, in the liberal sense of the word. But there's still a monarchy involved in the royal assent process.
Yeah, and I think the monarchy at this point is sufficiently subdued to, I suppose, stay in its lane and be there only in a very sort of subdued, quiet, advisory capacity, as opposed to anything more vocal than that. And I mean even a smidge over that. And Queen Elizabeth II has been very good at setting a precedent henceforth that will be, I suppose, adhered to by Charles, William, George, etc. If you, unless you Republicans abolish it, you bastards. But anyway, I think the monarchy is almost disempowered to the extent of where you don't need to worry about it in any real sense. And I suppose, fine, it is what it is, and it still exists, and therefore I think you can have your cake and eat it, because you have your monarchy and all the benefits it brings from a tourist and fascination perspective, and that is there is serious fascination. I mean, we are quite unique in that position to have maintained and managed to marry those two systems and allow them to coexist. I think that is an incredible achievement of diplomacy and restraint.
It's certainly rare, isn't it?
It's amazing. I mean, the restraint on both sides that had to have been displayed to get us to where we are, I think, is admirable.
No, it's certainly admirable that both sides were able to be appeased and kept in their lanes, without doing too much damage to the other party.
Well, look at the bloody French Revolution. Look what they did there. Right, that went down with a bang. Right, that went out with a bang.
Well, look at Oliver Cromwell. The bloody removal of the monarchy. Cromwell himself became one of the worst tyrants ever to have led the country, and he came from the Republican anti-monarchist stance. I suppose, Brother Bear, what this boils down to, right, is that you can't make generalizations. All monarchies are bad, or all Republican nations are free. And I definitely agree with you that the monarchy feels, in terms of effects on our daily lives, fairly insignificant in the UK.
Yes,
and
I honestly believe, as much as we British sort of love a happy medium, not too hot, not too cold, the Goldilocks zone, I think we've really, over time and through non-trivial effort, managed to find that sweet spot between a democracy and a monarchy coexisting. I think that's actually, if you sort of articulate it that way, it's quite an amazing achievement. And I think you can, honestly, and I don't think this is my naivety speaking, I think you can have the best of both worlds coexist and actually have a more productive society thanks to it. A society that both holds patriotism and the great values of democracy and free speech all in one?
You can, definitely. I wouldn't say the two are mutually exclusive, right? I wouldn't
No, they're
say
not.
that a monarchy excludes or necessarily even reduces the chances of having free speech in a modern society.
No, and free elections kind of was more to my point, but yeah.
Yeah,
But
free elections in more.
But I think it's a miracle of diplomacy that we've managed to sort of maintain both, and I'd like to think sort of refined and polished both to the point of where they can happily coexist. And I think it's quite amazing, actually. I keep saying that, but really thinking about it now, it's quite amazing how these potentially mutually exclusive paradigms have managed to find a beautiful middle ground where they complement each other almost, because the Queen's got her roles as a representative of the country, and just the gushing words of Michelle Obama when she came to visit Buckingham Palace, inviting presidents. We are a bastion, and she is a show of force and power and diplomacy and good grace and British manners. And I think I'd like to think, in sort of my rose and respects, that she represents the best of British, and she does. She is a true, in the true sense of the word, and a true advocate of this country and the best of what this country is about and has to offer.
Wow, Brother Bear. I didn't know you were such a monarchist, such a royalist.
Good God, neither did I, especially after 2 pints.
Yeah. And of course, a glass of Pimm's as well.
Yeah, it was on the lawn. And a cucumber finger sandwich. But no, I do, I suppose, articulating it now, and I rarely do touch this topic, because I suppose it's one of those books you have in the dusty corner of your mind, right? But now, sort of articulating it, I do realise that I think we're almost an example to be emulated in terms of managing the best of both, a monarchy and what it could offer a country, and the perspective and context it can offer to its prime ministers in a very much a light touch advisory role, and then having a free democracy, a fully fledged, beautiful democracy where protest is permissible and encouraged.
Well, you see, these are excellent points, and I think it's a shame that not many young people are actually aware of these benefits that come with a monarchy. I think people are very quick to criticize the monarchy, purely based on just visual judgments of all the pomp and circumstance.
Well, it's also that we punch above our weight through the Queen. I honestly believe
you mean
that.
On the international stage?
We do. Absolutely on the international stage, because the Queen, there is only one. When you say the Queen, you don't think of any other country other than the United Kingdom.
Right. And I'm not sure if that's colonialism or if that's just the branding and marketing of the British royals is just that bit greater than any other royals in the world.
Well, I think we're probably more associated with the royals than any other country, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the value, both financial in terms of shared values, and in terms of international relations that comes with that is absolutely brilliant. I don't think that you could logically argue against that. What doesn't sit right with me, Brother Bear, is the worshipping of individuals based on a birth title, and I think this is a personal thing in the way that I think America has rubbed off on me, and even being in Canada, there's a lot of anti-monarchist sentiment here. I think that the idea of being born into a position and being worshipped is something that certainly doesn't sit right with me when people have such a aversion to people on welfare. One of the things I found that was particularly difficult in British society was generally the groups are most against people on benefits are particularly pleased with the royal family, and I always found that quite hypocritical. The monarch is, in my eyes, the biggest benefit scrounger in the UK, the largest taker of tax receipts, for doing very little on the day to day. I do believe that the marketing of the royal family amplifies their role in society far more than the reality.
So what say thee to the figures I quoted earlier?
No need to dissect the figures. Were you talking about tourism in general? When you said
no,
4 times the amount, was it 4 times?
No. So in reality, it's good God, probably 20 times the amount the monarchy brings in versus what they take.
How do we
now?
track
This
that,
is
though,
tourism in the UK.
How is that? How are they directly linked to? And my question, I suppose, would be if you took away the legal requirement for citizens or subjects in this situation to pay into the royal purse, would those returns go away? Because if the royal family were kind of, in the Spanish sense, self-sustaining, and all the buildings were there, and maintained perhaps like the National Trust, but for the most part privatized, do you think that those revenues of the income would actually disappear?
I don't know, and I'm not sure. Not to be rude, I'm not sure I care. I think ultimately you want what the bottom line is, right? In terms of whether they're a net asset to the British taxpayer or a liability, and they fall into the former on all accounts, because ultimately the 62 million is fully disclosed in terms of that 2019 figure of how much they cost. That's the entire British royal family that year, the British public, and then they bring in. It's understood that they bring in the order of 1.8 billion. We're talking billions here.
But who takes that income? That's the thing. Everyone is charged the income to pay for them, but that doesn't trickle down to all members of society. All members of society pay into that, but they don't get that back. That's if you look at per capita, I feel like that figure, the 1.8 billion, albeit a figure that shouldn't be sniffed at, there's certainly an asset rearing side to the royal family. What I'm not convinced of is the distribution of that.
Right. So, I mean, even if you take it on face value, imagine if they've paid. I mean, I can't believe this would be the case, but just take it as an example that they paid 1.8 billion for teas and cups and cookies, or with a Queen's face on them in Buckingham Palace, Windsor, and Balmoral. If all that money was spent there, there's still people who came abroad and took time out of their day to visit those places, and will otherwise be staying in hotels, paying for meals, going to restaurants, paying for goods and services in and around the City of London or wherever they may be, and travelling on further within the UK. So I think it's tourism in the holistic sense as well.
But the goods and services consumed, with the argument I would make to that is they would be by people who are actually working, as opposed to just people who are sitting idle. And who?
Okay, so you're specifically referring to people who are scrounging or living off the benefit system.
I'm accusing the royals of scrounging and living off the benefit system. I think.
Well, I think if they're a net asset, then they're not that.
But they're a net asset inadvertently. It's not by their own choosing. So they're born into a system where they have to do nothing, and.
Well, no, okay. They don't do nothing.
They do nothing on the relative sense to a 40-hour week, or someone who works in a coal mine or a chip shop. And I think that there's a certain...
I think you'll be surprised how much the Queen does.
But what does she do? I want to be educated on how much she does. I understand that there's paperwork involved, but I feel like it's never been made transparent to me how much she does, Brother Bear.
Yes, I suppose there's a lot of diplomacy to be done in the meantime. There's the stuff we know of, such as the weekly meeting with the Prime Minister, which only takes up probably a few minutes of one day in a week. So I'd like to understand the breakdown, but I understand it's a non-trivial amount of work, especially with someone of her age, who'd normally, in normal society, be understood and well understood, that be retired at this age. And she's been of a retirement age for some time now.
Correct, but the luxuries that she lives off of your and my labour are so huge, I do feel that they outweigh any kind of ill experience that she may have through working into her later years. I think it's a principle thing, though.
So take it. Maybe. Let's assume she does nothing. So what? Like, it still brings in a net billion to the country. How could you argue? I suppose against. Just forgetting whether the monarchy is a good or bad thing. Why would you remove something that brings a net billion to the country through goods and services purchased?
Because it's forcefully and illegally stealing from the people. It doesn't matter what it brings in, and the trickle down isn't felt by all the payers. So it's like it's a casino where the game is rigged, is what I'm saying. It's and this is why I believe it's a matter of principle. We're talking about an institution that, in my eyes, robs from the people. And it doesn't bring back an even distribution, wealth and resources to those people. The other criticism I would have of the royal family as an institution, as something that's culturally important, is that I actually believe that the royal family encourages British citizens to be okay with some of the most insanely unequal land laws in the world. The leasehold system, the lack of regulation on property owning individuals, in terms of the maintenance and the charging. I think that there's a direct link, because in the UK, landowners are worshipped more than anything, more than business owners, more than workers. I think that people who own businesses and start their own businesses, and even the general worker, could be treated a lot better. But I think that the monarchy has developed this kind of almost unhealthy and extreme public perception of what it means to be a landowner.
So I think without ownership of one sort or another, whether that's land or whatever, you have no power, right? So, little to no power. So the likes of Thatcher really encouraged private ownership for that very reason, because you have nothing to borrow against otherwise. So I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with this, but
Thatcher actually gave people home ownership, arguably because it would bring them into debt, and she wanted to destroy the unions. So she actually knew that once people are in debt, they won't go on strike. Whereas if people live in council houses and they rent at lower rates or can be bailed out, they will. So I think that what Thatcher did was very clever, in that it liberated people in terms of home ownership, but it also destroyed their ability and bargaining power in the workplace. So it took away a lot of freedom. But without going on the Thatcherite tangent, because Thatcher was an incredibly divisive individual who, divided, for half of the country, she was hugely beneficial. either in home ownership sense or the the banking sense, or for the for the miners and the people of the north, it was the exact opposite story.
Yeah.
But I think, in my mind, Brother Bear, the monarchy is very wrapped up with the lack of regulation on the landowning classes in Britain. And I think that that's got a lot to do with people being okay with the way that landlords treat tenants even to this day. And I think that's been a historic problem in the UK.
So how would that manifest? What would a landlord do to mistreat a tenant?
Well, let's take a look at the situation in London.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the world, the rest of the Western world,
mm-hmm.
would the quality of housing for the price you pay is absolutely laughable. In the southern UK, the shortage in housing is a huge issue. It's probably the biggest issue facing the UK right now,
mm-hmm.
other than obviously the obvious elephant in the room of COVID. But to cut a long story short, for what you pay in the UK, particularly in the south where all the jobs and prosperity are,
mm-hmm.
what you get back is much lower than, say, a country like France or Germany or Canada, where there's rent controls, there are maintenance requirements for heating systems, for plumbing systems, and mold reduction and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of getting down into the weeds here, but I do believe that there's an efficacy for a system that unequal, that is also influenced by people's feelings of people's justification of a monarchy. I think the two go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. But isn't that something a little micro for something like a monarchy? Or are you saying that actually indirectly it does impact this area to a large extent?
I'd say culturally it has a large impact on people being comfortable with landlords having that kind of control in their lives. I think that the sphere of influence of the monarch is, as you said, it's much greater than people acknowledge, particularly on people's cultural lives. And I do believe that encourages a system whereby land ownership is worshipped as the kind of a deity, like state in the UK, in a way that it isn't in continental Europe. It is in the United States, but their situation is so different with how you can acquire property that it's almost not a fair comparison. But
yeah. Well, I think for a start, in Germany, they seem to have adopted what the World Economic Forum in 2020 was referring to as "you will own nothing and you will be happy," which sounds like the worst dystopia I've ever heard of in my life. And then on the American side, their houses are made of wood. So they're not even assets, they're depreciating liabilities, because you have to move on very quickly, because whether it's rot or it gets blown down by a bloody hurricane. I think you're investing in more than that in the UK because it's bricks and mortar, and actually it's the reason we've got Victorian houses, because they're still here.
Sure, on the material level, I agree with that.
Yeah,
but don't you think that the getting on the housing ladder is harder in the UK than pretty much any other Western country?
I'm not sure I've done sort of enough in-depth research to see what relative income can get you in another country, and how long it would take you to move from a position of being a renter to a position of ownership, if I'm really honest. But I was looking at properties and land in Denver, and it's very expensive, and I was probably looking at a hotspot. So the problem is also like US, looking at it from a perspective of a ruthless capitalist, you would say the best way I can make money in somewhere like Denver is buy a plot of land and build condos maybe 10 of them, multi-story. Pile them as high as the council will let me, or whatever the local authority says. I can also have private land ownership as a foreigner, so it's not a problem, and I'll build it out of lumber, and it will be relatively cheap, and then I won't actually let go of it because it's a pristine asset, and if I can pay off the debt, then why not? And if I can pay off the debt with the rent I accrue, then that actually works out pretty well. And so I'm not sure what I'm getting at, but I suppose there's loopholes and ways to make money and extort tenants in any given system, if you're smart about it.
Of course, yeah. I suppose extorting, or some would say exploiting tenants, is doable in any system.
But you can do it both ways, right? You're powerful as a tenant. Like, you can, if you want to, make a deal with a landlord, use your initiative, and say, I'm going to turn your living room into a bedroom. Are you okay with that? Sure. Okay, I'll rent that out. So that's going to subsidize my rent. Are we all good? We're all good. You're still getting your $1,600 a month. We're all good. We're all square. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm also getting my rent substantially subsidized. So everyone wins. The only problem, the downside is you don't have a living room. Well, that's a pretty small downside if you're talking about, reducing your rent by 50, 60, 70%. So I think that there's also an ownership and sort of moving away from just being a victim as a tenant, and understanding that, personal ownership and ownership of your own destiny sort of, I don't know, this is kind of getting into deep philosophical stuff, but for God's sake, you've got a lot more bloody agency than you think you do.
I think people do have a lot more agency than they consider, particularly in whether it's in business.
Well, and even then they'd like to consider, because it's scary. Because when you realise that there's more within your remit of power and domain of power and domain of change, then actually it points the finger straight back at your face.
Yeah, absolutely. I would, however, caveat that with, there's certain markets, London and New York, where tenants have I would say, a very minimal level of power and influence. I think there are those hacks, right, where you can approach your landlord, and try and approach it in a capitalist way to make some income off it yourself, and that's more power to you if you're doing that. But generally, more broadly speaking, I feel like the vulnerabilities lie with the tenant, and that's mainly down to supply and demand.
Yeah, agreed. And I wonder whether COVID's going to change that, Leo, because like people are, the relative attractions and upsides of a city are starting to dwindle in light of COVID, and I'm sure that the tide will change once COVID subsides. But people are looking to this the countryside, right, and looking at what their money can buy, and tends to be a lot more than what they can afford in the city as an equivalent.
Yeah,
as a people, yeah.
No,
it's an interesting dynamic.
It's a changing dynamic, right? Isn't it? I suppose COVID highlighted some vulnerabilities and push factors from the cities. The question is, if COVID is very temporary, how long will that drive to the country work? How long will it last?
Exactly.
But to kind of bring it back to the original.
The monarchy.
The monarch, and I can see that we're far from in agreement on this. I suppose the point I was just trying to make, Brother Bear, was just that of the cultural impacts of a monarchy. I think that the monarch has a major impact on British society, and admittedly, I'd be a clown for saying many of those weren't positive, whether it's in the kind of national unity sense, or in the civic pride, or even the financial receipts from tourism, which are certainly significant. I was more highlighting the downside. I feel like there is a certain negative consequence in the way that landlords are deified in the UK to almost an unhealthy extent.
Yes,
which often comes at the expense of business owners, because you've got to remember that business people who come up with amazing innovations and hire productive people, are also paying often exorbitant rates just because somebody owns property. There's a lot of dynamics behind why someone owns property. Did they work hard to get it, or did they inherit it? And in many cases, they inherited it. And what this all comes back to, Brother Bear, is the problem of inheritance. And the royal family is ultimately an institution of inheritance. And that's the point I was making in a nutshell.
Yes, and I think it's a worthy point and a point worth making. I think the inheritance of the royal family is, I suppose, the nature of the monarchy, right? It has to be that way. What I'm happy about is that the monarchy doesn't have any real say in policy, because that would be bad. It would be bad only because, and for one reason and one reason only, and I wouldn't have to go any further down the list because this reason would be sufficient as to why it would be a bad idea, is that you could end up, like I said, with a Nero or Caligula further down the lineage, which, would be undesirable for the population as a whole, because they would probably pass draconian laws on one side or another. And I'm glad that monarchy doesn't have a hand in that. And in a sense, I suppose the monarchy is now doing what the monarchy should do, and modern monarchies at least, should do in the sense of diplomacy and representation. So that's great. And then on the other side is the inheritance of property. So yes, that has to happen for the monarchy. I think it's justified by the fact that they bring in, they're a net positive, they're a net plus in terms of the tourism and goods and services bought off the back of that tourism. And then if we're talking about private ownership, I think there's something called inheritance tax that takes care of that, and it's a healthy 40%.
But the monarchy are an untaxed institution,
right? And I think that's okay, because they're an exception to the rule, because they are a net asset, in my humble opinion. And I really would want to look into these figures a bit deeper off the back of this conversation to make sure I'm right, that they are a net asset in hard numbers. And whether if they're not, they're not. And we probably would need to make a follow up on this in our next disclaimer at the upfront before we delve into our next topic. But it would be interesting to find out.
Yeah.
You could draw up an Excel and sort of look at the numbers off a trustworthy source. Would need to do that properly. And then the other bit is private ownership. I think inheritance tax is disgusting. I think it's abhorrent that it even exists, given the fact that the income made to even accrue the assets in terms of property have been taxed already in terms of income, and that person's worked hard to pay off that mortgage, and then to tax it twice on tax. It doesn't sort of fit in my head, but
death tax, as they call it.
Yeah,
brother, but
it's crazy.
Interesting. It's very interesting you bring up inheritance tax, because that's such. I mean, this totally relates to the monarchy as a concept as well. But this is a really divisive issue in the US. Actually, there's a large movement of ultra far conservatives that believe in doing away with virtually all tax, but putting inheritance tax at 100%. Tell me what you think of that.
Bloody hell. Why would you put inheritance tax at 100%?
Well, no, it's a good question, because it's such a strange take on it. So the argument is that your purchasing decisions throughout your life should be completely free from government seizure, as should your income, because that is 100% your labor. Tax is theft in that realm. However,
I see.
Yes, but so no income tax, no sales tax, and so on. However, your offspring are not deserving of your labor, because it's your labor, not theirs.
Well, it's completely fair. Well, because let's be honest, in any given person's life, inheritance tax is few and far between, as in it's not regular, therefore not predictable, therefore can't pay a government on a predictable basis. So it has to be from the income. Let's put some taint this with
reality, right? With practical rationale, and also
It's sporadic, right? Inheritance tax. We don't know who's going to die when.
Right. Very, very sporadic, and also that kind of system would be entirely difficult to implement because the amount of
to predict and implement.
Well, the gifting, right? So before, when, for example, someone knows that their time is drawing close, the amount of gifting to other sources would skyrocket, and that's incredibly hard to regulate. So that's, in some ways, it's almost an impossible system to even implement.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be more of this sort of lowering tax rates, doing almost a Singapore or Hong Kong model where you tax at a 10 or 15% rate. It means that much more disposable income for people to buy goods and services within that economy and just, drive it up. And then, and I think inheritance tax, I don't quite understand it because it's surely on income you've post-tax, therefore you used to pay off that mortgage and, over a lifetime, and then it gets another tax whacked on top of it. It's very strange, and I don't quite understand how it exists. I suppose it's just another way or ploy of the government to take more of your sterling or dollar.
Yeah, I think it's a big kick in the nuts, isn't it? Because you've been paying.
It's horrible.
You've been paying so much, right, through your entire life. And then to be taxed after your debt is, there's some members of my family would actually prefer to just burn all their money than actually give it to the government after. Yeah, I think it's a super divisive issue. I mean, tax in general, this conversation, a lot of it's
I mean, how do you tax? Like, that income's been taxed. Why are you taxing it again? Like, it's someone's savings. Say someone over their lifetime, say 200k, and they've got it. They're in an account. Why does it to transfer it to your account? Why do you need to tax it?
Yeah, I think it's the tax.
It's been taxed
tax on the transfer, right? Than the actual. I don't know. I think people justify it through, the recipient is not as deserving as the saver. So therefore redistribute.
Bitcoin will solve all of this.
Okay, I love the Bitcoin topic, and I can't wait for you to educate me on that, Brother Bear, very soon. But before we finish up this conversation, let's talk about in the final 5-10 minutes. Let's talk about the future of the royals, giving the light behind this. Do you think that Meghan Markle's the words that she said, do you think she was justified in making that public, and what do you think the implications might be for the royal estate?
I understand the whole dynamic. I think I understand somewhat what she means by the British tabloids, because the British tabloids have no allegiance, and so they will skew and misconstrue anything and everything just to get a story and just to sell papers, and I think they are quite disgusting. But as long as you understand they're disgusting, that's fine. I think when you take them a bit too seriously and take it to heart, that's when it becomes a problem. And obviously Harry and Meghan did. Harry's got the post PTSD, I'm sure, from Diana, which has to be factored into all of this, and how the tabloids supposedly contributed to that. And they are awful if you read them. If you don't and try and sort of be stoic about it, as hard as that is, you might be able to survive it. And in any case, it's interesting and paradoxical that, all of this media attention in the UK, particularly from the tabloids apparently, and then they go to one of the singular biggest chat show hosts in the world. Like, do you want publicity or not? You do, but you don't. And it's a bit strange. So I'm not sure where they're coming from. Maybe they want to monetize themselves because they realize they've sort of been cut off from the, I suppose, the breast of the royal family. And so they're not getting the good milk of the royal family, and therefore they're going to have to market themselves in one way or another. And potentially the Oprah interview was the start of that.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a bit of dissonance, right? Because on one hand, they're saying that they want a complete divorce from that public scrutiny,
Yeah,
and then in the next stroke, they seem to be pursuing kind of sensationalist news,
yeah,
and it's confusing, isn't it? Like, what do you want? Do you want to be in the public eye? Some people think that the allegations were true, but despite that, the two of them are kind of extreme narcissists.
I think there's probably some truth in that, particularly from Megan's side. But I feel like maybe they kind of again want the cake and eat it. They want all of the positive affirmations that media and attention can bring you, with none of the drawbacks, which is I suppose an unrealistic expectation, right?
Absolutely, yeah. No, very well put. They want the best of both, but you just can't, right? You can't have all the glory and the glitter and none of the nasty bits that the tabloids bring into that equation. But nevertheless, I think that and actually I'm gonna go more towards your angle here, Andre. It did kind of give me a pang of disappointment in the way that certain scandals have played out over the past couple of years. Just because the royal family is supposed to be this kind of unifying force of I suppose UK identity. And civic pride, and it's a shame when you see the kind of frailties of these people, whether it's the scandal with Prince Andrew, whether it's the situation with Harry and Meghan. That has some major political implications, and I think it's a shame in general.
I agree. However, all I'd say is that yes, you see these cracks. And then you realise, actually, they're all human. And, they're only human. And as much as they're sort of elevated to the level of royal, they've done incredibly well to maintain as pristine of an image as they have. And, there is the scattering and smattering of these scandals, namely Prince Andrew, the whole allegations there, and there's no clear conclusion there. The Meghan Markle thing. But I think the Queen's done a decent job at trying to mitigate these to the best of her ability. And I think it's a thankless job in a way because, in a way, she's a servant leader, right? She had no choice in the matter. So I'm not sure it's an enviable position, if that even was a consideration going into this conversation.
Absolutely. It's probably not an enviable position to be in at all. So to turn the conversation on its head here, is it a privilege, or is it actually the very opposite of that, being born into a royal title?
Well, if the Crown's anything to go by, and I know it's sort of based on rumour and whispers here and there, the Queen has a profound sense of duty, but it's not a duty that she takes on naturally, and it's not something she embraced wholeheartedly, at least to start with. But I suppose she realised that the weight of the country was on her shoulders, and the weight of the monarchy and the continuation of the monarchy was on her shoulders. And put yourselves in someone like little George's shoes. He probably barely understands what the monarchy is, and yet if it does continue as long as he will be alive, then he will inevitably become king. And that's quite, when you put it that way, you look at him as a child, that's quite a terrifying burden. And I'm not, if someone will give me the choice whether I'd be who I am now or king, I'd rather be me.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah, no, likewise. Final comment, closing comment. Do you think we'll have a monarchy in 50 years' time, and what might that look like?
Great question. I think we will. I think we will have a monarchy. I think it will be, if anything, even one more step back from government. Potentially those weekly meetings with the Prime Minister will no longer be a feature. And again, the royal family will be more of a marketing tool. I can imagine Prince George on TikTok and Instagram.
Or whatever exists then, whatever social media platform.
Whatever exists then, exactly. Whatever social media. I'm sure TikTok will be a bygone era. But no, I think, whatever social media and VR technology and virtual reality will play a daily part in our lives in the future. I think Prince George will look to engage with that because by definition he is a digital native and understands the importance of, I suppose, maintaining some form of tradition, because I think tradition is going nowhere and I think we will be misty-eyed for a very long time, and understands maybe the importance of the monarchy as a stabilizing force.
Brilliant. What a refreshing answer. I think on that note, we can wrap up this conversation. Thank you very much for your time today.
Really enjoyed that, Brother Bear.
Absolutely.
That was great.
I loved it. And thank you to all the loyal subjects for tuning in today and listening to this discussion and debate on the monarchy. Goodbye.
Bloody marvellous. Have a good one, guys. Take care. Bye. Pow!